Hi, this is Ronnie Chaudhary. I'm the director of the Center for Connected Multimodal Mobility. It's a US duty UTC. So as you know, we have distinguished speakers presenting for our center. So this week we are very fortunate to have Dr. Cara Kockelman from the University of Texas at Austin. Now Charlotte Riggs, who is the coordinator of our center, will introduce Cara.
Yes,
Hi,
thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. So like he said, we have Dr. Cara Kockelman. She's a registered professional engineer. She holds her PhD, MS, and BS all in civil engineering, as well as a master's of city planning and a minor in economics, all from the University of California at Berkeley. She's a professor of transportation engineering and has been at the University of Texas at Austin for the last 22 years. As well as being the primary and co-author of over 160 journal articles and 2 books covering a variety of subjects, almost all of which involve transportation-related data analysis. Her primary research interests are planning for electric, shared, and autonomous vehicle systems, statistical modeling of urban systems, including models of travel behavior, trade and location choice, energy and climate issues, so transportation and land use decisions, the economic impacts of transportation policy, and crash occurrences and consequences. So, and you can find a list of all of her papers and research interests linked on our website along with the video of this talk. So we keep these on our YouTube channel and all our social media platforms to give everyone access. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Kockelman.
Thanks so much. It's nice to see a lot of friends on here. And I was just speaking with one of the postdocs who's doing research in related areas about crashes. And of course, these smart vehicles that we're going to be talking about today do have that capability, thank goodness. So that's one of the driving forces for automation, is really making things safer out there and helping get us towards that vision zero. But one of the biggest drivers on the consumer side, of course, is not having to drive. And so that is, I think, very appealing to most women and quite a few men, although there are some diehards. Of course, shared mobility is really valuable because of the congestion issues and the emissions issues and the cost issues of motorized transport. So you've got here some Google vehicles, a Tesla, the Cruise pod up in the upper right, and then a city mobile project, demonstration project at low speeds that's been going through many cities in Europe over the past 8 years, so quite some time. So we'll be talking about the shared fleets and the rise in maybe 8 different papers. We'll be seeing results from those quickly, as well as this idea of congestion pricing because of the added demand that comes from making motorized travel even easier in this country. So a lot of different students engaged in this work. Dan Fagnant and I started just thinking about this almost 10 years ago, and he did those first simulations, and then we shifted to Jonna Chen, who now teaches at University of Virginia, Ben Loeb, who works for the Philly MPO. Greta Murti is still here with me, thank goodness. He's doing some great dissertation work, and Michele Simoni is going to teach at the University of Stockholm. So let me activate this. As some of you may know, if you read Dan's work with me, we started very small on a town, basically a 10-mile by 10-mile town with a gridded zones. And since we're not computer scientists, it was kind of a simplistic setup, but it is not easy to do this, especially 9 years ago when he started programming this. And we were working on a 5-minute horizon and using densities of trip making that sort of mimic the average Austin area, but so we started at the Central Business District and kind of went out 5 miles in almost every direction. And you can see there at this quarter-mile zone, you're seeing that Poisson mixing by time of day. So there's a lot of inbound trips in the morning and outbound trips in the afternoon, but they can go any which way. And we're just trying to mimic a National Household Travel Survey data at that point. And a lot of those trips go back, right to where they came from. So about almost 80% of US trips are round trips. But they couldn't be very long. We didn't really allow anything over 15 miles because you'd almost have to go corner to corner to achieve that, or I guess 14.2 miles, something like that. So it's, you know, it's not real trip making, but it gave us a sense of how it might work maybe in a central business or core area of a region, or a small town where nobody was allowed to leave. And then we made it more interesting. We went for a 12-mile by 24-mile region. We used the real trip attraction and generation and origin destination pairings that Austin has in its 12 by 24-mile central core. And you can see it's very heavily structured along this corridor, which is Interstate 35. And then we have another freeway, US 183, going through here. Here's the downtown and the university right in the darkest areas. And we use travel times that mimic the real street network. We didn't have endogenous congestion at this point because this was still our own code. And we had ride sharing enabled, which is very important because most cars have fewer than, you know, 2 people. They have 1 person. It's a very discreet thing, of course, but only on long distance trips do you start to see 2 or 3 or 4 people on average in those vehicles. So lots of excess seating capacity. And then we were using some relocation actively. So that's what those red lines are there. And I'll show you this in a slightly, larger scale here. So this is one SAEV over a 24-hour day, serving about 42 trips with a couple relocations early on there. Those 2 red segments are proactive relocation to try to find a zone, especially a 2-mile by 2-mile zone that had more demand likely in the next 5 minutes than supply in a ratio of demand to supply. And of course, it's expected demand. Every minute differs, every day differs. And so Uber and Lyft and other like Didi in China, they kind of have a sense, and they try to get their drivers to shift towards where they can expect higher demand. But the drivers themselves are mostly doing that right now based on their experiences and their knowledge of special events going on in the city, that kind of thing, around the world. So these vehicles are busy about 8 hours a day. It's like you and me, going to work. So they're not busy 24 hours a day unless you want them to start doing some kind of freight delivery at night. Maybe you could use this fleet more intensively. And he started with about 56,000 person trips being served over a 24-hour period, and then just pushed that number up as he felt his code was efficient enough to do that. But it's nowhere near, the 6 million person trips that get served a day in the Austin region. Of course, this is just the core of the region, but it's still quite a bit fewer. 270,000 trips is quite a bit fewer than what you would see normally in that core area. But excellent levels of service, still well under 2.5 minutes, which is the minimum time, because we're using that 5-minute horizon, and people come up with trip requests at any second, so we had to add on 2.5 minutes to every wait time that we were noticing, because we figured people weren't going to wait for the 5-minute mark. And with one of these scenarios, I think it might have been about 100,000 trips that we were serving. You can see the extra vehicle miles travel that's being introduced by having these vehicles kind of running around empty at times, but trying to get people to share rides, having more than seating for the travel party was about 5% extra VMT, which is better than you can do when they're not ride sharing. Okay, so DRS is dynamic ride sharing. That means at any moment the vehicle might be able to place you with somebody. It's not a prearranged carpool. And 8% in this particular scenario, but we were able to get that 4.9 down to a negative percentage when we went up to the 270,000 trips, because there were just more and more probability of an origin or a destination being similar, or a direction of travel being similar for these travelers. And the wait times go up a little bit when you have the ride sharing, but of course people are saving money. So I think like 40% of people in Chicago ask for the pooling option, which is great. It could be even higher. Not all get matched, but they get this lower price by being willing to share. And so that extra 0.6 minutes doesn't really bother them, as you can imagine. And the real wait times in sort of a continuous framework would be, you know, less than a minute that we could get to them. We also were able to get rid of more of household vehicles. So the number of vehicle trips per day is this sort of simple metric that Dan was using to calculate these conversions. And so these are too optimistic because you're still within a town, basically a 12-mile by 24-mile town. And so you can't leave. And so if the number of trips you make with your vehicle per day is the same as the current American household, then you might get a 1 to 10 replacement as long as you're doing ride sharing, and just a 1 to 8 if you're not. And that's a great news for parking, right? And that's pretty good news for capital investment, although these vehicles will have to be retired much faster, you know, every 2 years rather than every 16 years, let's say, because they're working 8 hours a day rather than 1 hour a day as our current vehicles tend to work. And he started looking at the cost, which was really helpful, because even with a $25,000 technology cost to make these conventional vehicles into self-driving vehicles, you could make 20% return on your investment with $1 per mile fare. And so that's $1 per revenue mile. You've got a passenger in the vehicle. And then Donna started looking at a much bigger region. So this is 100 mile by 100 mile, and making the vehicles all electric. So she also had to cite some charging stations, as you can imagine, especially with the shorter range vehicle. It was an old Leaf with just 60 miles, you know, safe range on it, let's say, and an older Model S with just 200-mile range on it. So those were two of the scenarios she tested, and we found that it was cheaper to not have a human present ready to plug in the vehicles when they came in to be charged. So an inductive charging pad seems to be the way to go on those kinds of fleets. But you will have humans working on at many of the stations to help, you know, make sure detectors are working and sensors are clean. And all of these scenarios using like a Camry, like a smart Camry was what Dan was considering, or these Leaf and Model S, you know, lots of emission savings there, even in some of the dirtiest parts of the US grid these days because of the retirement of so many coal-fired power plants. And the biggest savings, I think, come from the fact that you're using a more efficient vehicle to begin with, right? Like a Camry as a sedan is a more efficient vehicle than many others in the fleet we see, especially here in Texas. Maybe not for California these days, but Texas has a lot of pickup trucks and a lot of SUVs, unfortunately. And the cold starts went down a lot because these vehicles were starting warm. They stayed mostly warm, those engines. So cold starts are getting close to being 50% of our tailpipe emissions, and that's awful. So if you can keep that catalytic converter hot and you can keep the engine warm, that helps a lot versus the business as usual case here. And like I said, the more trips you have, the more likely that you can get total vehicle miles down without forcing the ride sharing. So you don't make people wait until you find 3 people or something like that. You just say, is this reasonable? They're going to save maybe 40% on the cost of this getting to their destination. It's going to cost them more time though, and they're going to have some strangers in the car with them. Who's going to do it? And so only if I think the wait time was less than 5 minutes or 10% of their total travel time would he have put the 2 people together, or maybe added a 3rd person. So it was a very reasonable rule, and it might have also followed a logit. So there were people who, even if it looked like a great deal, they weren't going to take it. Most recently, this is a pretty recent paper at my website by Murty, Guru Murty, and he's using the POLARIS tool, which comes out of Argonne National Lab, but he has been instrumental in coding it for shared autonomous vehicles and dynamic ride sharing. And the Chicago code keeps changing, so we actually demonstrated this on Bloomington, which is a small town in Illinois. And he's doing this aggregation, so this spatial clustering of pickup and drop-off points rather than letting people go door to door. And that's going to be really important in the downtowns or on busy streets or at busy, you know, airport curbs, places where there's a lot of pickup and drop-offs. You do need some uniformity and rulemaking. And so we're seeing that in our nation's capital and big cities, including Houston. and especially at airports, of course, almost all airports that you and I would tend to go to tend to have special pickup and drop off locations to try to manage that congestion at the curb. And so SAVs will, have even more, I think, demand than we see with networking companies, at least when the prices fall, to be competitive. So maybe in 10 years or something, that'll be very common. And there's also going to be longer trip making and that kind of thing. So not just that empty vehicle miles traveled, but some longer trip making. So there's going to be a lot of added congestion from making driving easier, whether it's your own private AV or it's a shared one that you rent from a fleet manager. So dynamic ride sharing is super important. Same thing with the congestion pricing that we'll be talking about. So he's simulating ride sharing and the pickup and drop off or aggregation of stops to see what that does to the operation of that shared fleet and walking distances, these kinds of things, response times for the travelers. And like I said, he's using POLARIS, which comes from Argonne National Lab. So Josh Auld, he wrote his dissertation under Kouros Mohammedian. I don't want to mistake that last name. It's a tricky one for me. But he's been at Argonne for, at least 10 years, I'd say. And so it's this great tool, very fast for Chicago. And now we're bringing it to Austin. And of course, this is Bloomington that you're going to see the results for. And so they've had to, Murthy's had to help the Argonne team add this kind of code, which is fine. He has helped do this before with MatSim, which is a code from ETH in Germany and Switzerland. And so they're matching en route. They're checking mostly on directionality, I guess, as well as, of course, time of day, because the trips are coming in randomly. So you can't, there's no pre-planning really. And it just, depending on where they are in space, they'll decide what the drop-off is. So the first person who gets in may be the last to get out if she's making a really long trip. So I've had that happen to me when I went from Mountain View in the Bay Area all the way to downtown San Francisco to a Hyatt hotel or something for a big autonomous vehicle symposium, and people were getting on and off, and I was just reading, So it worked for me. It really saved me a lot of time and money and no transfers. So I just stayed in my seat that whole time. Bloomington's small. It's not even 10 miles by 10 miles, quite honestly. It's only 120,000 residents and only about 2,800 unique locations for pickup and drop off or for node choices, I guess, in the case of these PUDO stops. And so you can see those aggregated stops in red, whereas the grays are where Argonne National Lab already has origin and destination trip data for Bloomington. And the nice thing about POLARIS is it's also, an activity-based model. So endogenously, the departure times and the destinations are changing, as well as the modes, of course. And we couldn't get destination to change in the MatSim model, which is why we shifted. But it is proprietary, so we can only get it by working very directly with them. And it's been a great collaboration. At the bottom of this picture, you're seeing a 0.52 mile. This is the distance between stops. This is the minimum distance between these pickup and drop off stops, and a clustering algorithm has been used. So you could have more red dots, but it wouldn't be so useful. It wouldn't map to many travelers. So this is, the case for maybe a small town, but we went ahead and we bumped up the number of trip makers by a factor of 5. And then a factor of 25. And we had different distances on those stops. So rather than every quarter mile, we also had them every half mile. And let's see, I think we also had them every mile, or no, so 0. Okay, so we had 3 scenarios. One is 0 spacing, you can get picked up door to door. And then you have to maybe walk as much as an 1/8 of a mile to get to your stop, or maybe as much as a quarter of a mile, because the stops can't be any closer than 0.5 miles. So that's kind of the expectation of the max walking distances, although I think there were some people in very rural settings or something for this town that actually had to walk further than you might guess. And like I said, we bumped up the trip intensities quite a bit because Bloomington's not very interesting. It's not a big US city. And if we bumped it up to 25 times, that was about 15 million person trips that were being simulated. So, may look like Hong Kong, So the factor of 5 might look like Austin, factor of 10 might look like Chicago, factor of 25 might, I suppose, look like Hong Kong. And of course, the network is not changing because it's very tedious for us to do all this. So we just raised the travel times. We basically, you know, it was going to be overwhelmed by this trip making. So we let the capacities go up, but not so much. We let some travel times rise too. And our basic objective there was to keep the mode splits kind of unchanged, even though in Hong Kong, nobody drives and not too many people drive in Chicago during, you know, peak times of day as well. So in the central area. And we were scaling up the fleet sizes. So depending on the mode choice in this model, we had about 1 SAV for every 70 persons picking it on their trips. And if it were more than 10 minutes away, the vehicle generally was not considered for the match to the traveler. And we assumed, I guess everybody was willing to consider dynamic ride sharing, but you know, not that many people ended up choosing it because of wait times or something like that. And so we only matched people if that was, you know, that we didn't have any matching if it was more than a 10-minute or a 15% delay on your trip. And we only found about in this scenario about, you know, 7 to 8% of people actually choosing the SAV. We had lots of people choosing to drive alone or have an AV drive them, so a smart vehicle driving them, but not being able to run around empty after the person reached their destination. So I never recommend that policymakers or communities or you and I advocate for letting a privately owned AV drive empty. That would be a colossal mistake in my opinion, unless it's an emergency. So they can, you know, they can be ticketed, but then, you know, they may have a very good story about why their wife was giving birth and they had to send the vehicle home or something to help her because all of the Uber vehicles were busy at that moment. Hard story to believe, but you know, there might be some weird situation where it had to be driven empty, but not to cruise for a parking space or anything like that. We had high occupancy vehicle, biking and walking. And in that base scenario where there's not any ride sharing even permitted, but maybe you do have and you don't have the pickup and drop off stops, we were serving about 65 trips per vehicle per day, which is amazing. That's pretty amazing to me, because if you remember Dan's work in like the 12-mile by 24-mile region, they were serving maybe 42 trips per day. This is shorter. This is just 7 miles by 10 miles. So quite a bit smaller, I guess, than Dan's, but that's a lot. And it's partly because the trips are so short, but they are traveling a fair bit, over 400 miles a day, whereas our vehicles might travel 20 miles a day or 25 miles a day, let's say. So there's a big jump. And there was a lot of empty vehicle miles traveled in that SAV fleet. Remember, it's not a big piece of the pie. So there are not as many matches as you might be thinking in the base scenario. And, you know, there were these different trip intensities. So that empty vehicle mile travel does go down, but just a few percentage points as we added the trip density. So that was really disappointing without these things, that people weren't going to be choosing it. And once we enabled it and didn't make people wait a long time, but assumed they would use it if the travel times were reasonable and didn't have the pickup and drop off stops, you got more people being served per SAV per day because some people were sharing. You got a fair bit less of that empty or zombie travel. And then you got total VMT also kind of actually went down for those people. So if those people had driven themselves instead of taking an SAV, what would that VMT have been? So even though there was empty vehicle miles traveled, there was enough sharing going on to make up for it. And of course, with the dynamic ride sharing, you're going to have slightly longer response times and travel times, but there'll be a savings on the payment to the traveler if she gets matched, and maybe if she doesn't get matched. So right now, if you ask to be matched, sometimes you'll be sent directly, and you'll still pay the lower fare. So the average vehicle occupancy, AVO, is average vehicle occupancy, and the percent of the empty travel was not too much affected by the trip density, which was interesting to me, because normally I was expecting a convex relationship between trip making and those vehicle occupancies, or that probability of matching people. So that's not something I had necessarily seen or expected from other simulations, but POLARIS is allowing us to simulate a lot of things, a lot of endogenous behaviors that I haven't done in many of my other papers. So most of my papers, mode choice is not a thing. We're just directing everybody to the SAEV and seeing what happens. But here, mode choice is playing a big role. And then the stop placement also didn't have a big effect. So if you look at it with a bar chart, the bar chart is for this left axis here, it's the total vehicle miles with a little typo here on the axis. This is a very new plot, you guys. So as we brought the spacing up, didn't do too much in the base scenario, but if we increase the density of trip making, then increasing the distance between the stops, so those are the blue bars getting to the 0.5 mile, you did reduce VMT even further. But of course, you're making people walk, which is not as bad as it sounds. It's really good for human health in general, but if they have a lot to carry with them, that could be really problematic. So they may want to pay a surcharge to have a door-to-door. And of course, if they're disabled, they may need to go door-to-door. So you can't expect everybody to do the walking portion, I suppose. And then these lines that you're seeing, those correspond to the right side axis. And this is how many vehicle miles traveled. Again, we got the same typo. That's kind of cute. So on the, and it's quite significant. So we're getting down almost to a negative 16% reduction versus having had those people drive themselves. But we are sort of forcing them to share as long as the delay isn't too big, and making that a choice as part of your mode choice. We won't get quite as many people sharing, because we do surveys on this, and a fair number of Americans are not willing to share. Maybe eventually they will be, but you know, you can imagine a young female at night, probably less likely to share with strangers. I can tell you, however, when I share on Lyft, which is the application I go to first, they are almost always placing me with other women and usually with female drivers. So apparently, and I have very good response times, so apparently they're working hard to make women feel more comfortable as drivers and as passengers. So some of the insights is that it did help lower congestion, having ride sharing, of course, but it will depend on their willingness to share the rides with strangers. And the high density settings did help lower the total VMT, because the empty vehicle travel is shorter. There's a call coming very close to wherever you dropped off your last traveler. And it might be at the same location because we've aggregated those addresses, basically. Parking is always a big policy mover. That cost of parking downtown really helps reduce the choice of driving. And so you'll see travelers looking at parking very closely when they make these decisions. The stop use, by aggregating those addresses, we were basically increasing the vehicle occupancy of it and lowering the VMT, but it does require more walking, which might help reduce healthcare costs in the US and elsewhere. But we're real losers on the healthcare situation, so it'd be great to see Americans walking more. Dedicated infrastructure can be important. We were getting some queuing, actually. Some of those places were so popular that the vehicles were lining up and the passengers were lining up, so it could be kind of chaotic. So you'll need some special investments at the more popular stops. Okay, I'm going to take you back to a big region now. This is Austin. This is a 2 million population rather than like a 150,000 base population. And I'm going to talk about the all-electric case. So this is 6 counties, and you know, the electrification is pretty darn important because of climate crisis or climate emergency, and we are expecting vehicle miles traveled to rise by about 25% from all sorts of factors. One is, you know, new travelers that have not been able to drive themselves. One is longer trip making by existing travelers, and then there's that empty vehicle miles traveled. There's also freight. There's people leaving the airlines for 500-mile distance type flights or 300-mile distance type flights or 200 miles and going onto the ground now with a vehicle that can leave at a moment's notice, doesn't need to be paid for weeks in advance. You can put 3 or more people in that and kind of go door to door, which is a real benefit over flying. But the sensors and the computers on board do require power, and so that helps shift the needle for the manufacturers towards electrification, thank goodness, because we have a lot of control over the feedstock, and that can help with the greenhouse gases Also helps with smell and noise. We have a Tesla Model 3, the shorter range one, and our garage smells awesome. And yeah, the only downside is if you're backing up and somebody doesn't hear you, they may not even notice that you're coming their way. But in general, quite a vehicle. So battery electric vehicle technology is being obviously promoted very heavily in California and China and Norway, I think, Finland, places. We really do need this to grow, and automation may really help quite a bit with that. There's also road tolling that can help quite a bit in offsetting this added demand and getting people to share rides and get into more efficient vehicles, especially if the tolls recognize the smaller size, so higher capacity effectively of the smaller vehicles. So we took a shared vehicle. We had some kind of inductive charging going on, or maybe a robotic arm, something more sophisticated than this, I suppose. But this is just to give you an idea to save on the labor costs of having a human standing by ready to plug it in and unplug it. But you will have people at the more popular stations and wandering around to check on these vehicles, to check on their sensors, because these automated vehicles are tricky, and all vehicles, especially if they're being driven 400 miles a day, need a little bit of care and checking for gum and drinks that got left over, or even backpacks and briefcases, things like that. You need somebody on the ground helping out with that. And when it's all electric, then the charging duration and the charging location are very important. We have lots of gas stations around the US, and we can pay. There's usually often an attendant that you could pay to come out if you were going to start a fleet with a hybrids, let's say, rather than all electric. And so what we did is basically assume that if a vehicle couldn't make it to the next call, and then to get that call to its destination and get to a station, then we would put a station right down next to it. And so we started creating these station locations very simply, very heuristically. And then once we got through the 24-hour day, we left those stations and checked whether any were underutilized, and we removed them. So 30 days of more simulations, and then removed all the underutilized stations, and nobody got stranded in this 6-county region. So very simple. One of these situations is for the short range old Leaf 60-mile range vehicle. That's the one on the right, because you can see a lot more stations needed when you have short range. The one on the left is for that 200-mile range vehicle. Now, I wouldn't build this few stations. If you're going to do this, if you guys are going to, it's going to be your next business venture, go ahead and build a lot of stations. Just make them smaller than they would. So if you only need this many, you just don't need to have as many cords. But you don't want these vehicles that are dropping somebody off, let's say in Bastrop, to go chasing these stations and go a far way, maybe from Temple, going all the way back here to get the car charged so it can go help people back in Temple. Although Temple remains without a point here. This is kind of interesting. Even Killeen and Lampasas are missing a point here. So you'll probably end up building one out there too, and the people who live there will be very appreciative, because it will help with the response times in those 3 cities. And we went ahead and took a look at a Prius hybrid fleet, basically, and added automation to that versus that sort of short range Leaf and a longer range Tesla. We used slow charge and fast charges. And so a slow charge took 4 hours to fully bring the battery up, which, oftentimes it doesn't need. 4 hours versus 30 minutes is what we were looking at. And only 19 gas stations needed for that Prius, which has a range of 500 miles versus, you're going to need for the slow range and the short range slow charge, you're going to need 155. So to be fair, we went with the same 155 across these scenarios. We did reduce the size of the fleet in this scenario by maybe 20%. And so that we kind of cheaped out to see what we could get away with, how much that impacted like the wait times per trip. And so we went from just 4.5 minutes in this 6-county region with a lot of rural locations, okay? Not a lot of people live in them, but people do live in those rural locations. 4.5 minutes versus 5.5 minutes in our best scenario with the all-electric fleet. And that was the Tesla with a 30-minute charge, but we kept as many stations as we had for the Leaf situation. I think it would be hard to compete. So, you know, we want to electrify. Hybrids are great. I have a Prius. I love it. But, you know, all electric is kind of what we need to protect this planet from really just hitting more and more tipping points and causing more and more loss and damage, not just to our species and our investments, but all of the species are suffering because of this. So fleet size was pretty important. If you looked at the response times, that cheap fleet over here, you know, the response times of 10 minutes, it was sort of like having, even though this was a fast charge long range, it was like having a short range slow charge fleet almost. And longer charge times also created problems, especially for unserved trips. So not everybody could get served within 30 minutes. Even if you were using the Prius, you had to say, I'm so sorry, we're going to have to give you your trip for free or something, but you couldn't serve about 1.6% of the trips within 30 minutes with this fleet size using Priuses. And it's the hardest time of day, as you can imagine, is the afternoon peak. So from about 5 to 6 p.m. is where these fleets get really stressed. And if they're already out of charge and you're sending them back to a charging station, you've got some real problems with the all-electric fleet unless you go with that long-range vehicle. So that was really helpful in competing with the Priuses. And the urban core, man, if you lived in the urban core, you had no wait time practically. Nobody missed, you know, a trip. And your trips were often served in less than 2 minutes. And so it was pretty amazing. And when we asked people which way they think they might move, towards the center, away from the center, if there's a, you know, bunch of AVs and shared AVs in the future, and about 8% want to move back towards the center and get rid of their cars. They know they're going to have really good response times in those settings. Another 10% think they're probably going to move further out, creating more sprawl for us, I'm afraid. So financial results, very important, right? We talked about the 20% return on $1 per mile earlier. Well, Ben went ahead and I think he assumed a 20% technology cost on just a Prius versus a Bolt. So he used a Chevrolet Bolt for these other scenarios. And a Bolt's kind of a nicer vehicle in certain ways than a Prius in terms of bells and whistles. So it may not have been a perfectly fair comparison, but I'm afraid it was like 30% more expensive per passenger mile served than the Prius. And so without subsidy, you know, we are thinking that it will be more expensive. And there's a lot of assumptions behind all this. We did run high and low scenarios on the pricing. So I hope you'll read the paper if you want to get more information. But look at this. I mean, this is beating car ownership, right? 45 cents a mile. A little bit of wait time, but hey, I have to wash my car. I have to walk to my car. I have to, you know, buy my car, sell my car, maybe crash my car. Oh my gosh, all these headaches of car ownership. Look at these prices. This is pretty amazing. It may not be a big Suburban or SUV that I'm in, but generally most people don't care too much about that unless they're carrying like a pack of dogs or a bunch of kids with them. So yeah, these are great prices. This is a zero profit price, but this is about, this is actually less than what most transit agencies pay per passenger mile in terms of operating and capital subsidies. Okay, so long term, I guess I probably should have hidden this slide. I'm sorry this is showing up, but there are all these additional pieces adding to vehicle miles traveled, and I've already mentioned them. So we are expecting, you know, 25% more vehicle miles traveled, which is like 50% more congestion or something because of the convexity. And even if you force the manufacturers to follow the preceding vehicle at like a half-second headway, or I'll say a 1 second headway, which is a little bit scary, right, for drivers and passengers. But that's only really going to help you on the freeways, and a lot of our travel is, you know, subject to signals, and it's just going to take a long time. But someday we will be forcing them to follow at tight headways, and it'll still be very congested out there. So tolling becomes really important, and this is part 4 of a very long presentation where we have the mode choice and we have the congestion pricing. We don't have destination choice though, because at this point, this goes back a year or two, we were using MATSIM, so no destination choice, but you know, certainly taking a look at this electronic road pricing sort of thing. Hopefully not these big gantries. This is kind of ugly, although Singapore does a great job of this. It's not as ugly as what we do here in Texas with our road pricing. Singapore has now moved to a second generation pricing, or next gen, I guess I should call it, where they're using cellular transmission. So they can charge lane by lane in any point on that island at any time of day. We're looking at the city of Austin in this scenario, so we're not including like the Westlake Hills here. It's kind of a fragmented edge to this city, but this is an odd corridor. So I think McKelly allowed vehicles to go from red to red, but origins and destinations are only in these red areas. And because we were using MatSim, we had to, it's a slower code, but it's open source, which is fantastic. We used a 5% sample from the 1 million population that's in this red area. And we had about 3 different modes and lots of people in this current base scenario, 2020, lots of them having access to cars. And then we assumed, well, what if we replaced a lot of those cars with a self-driving car? And so they have access to an AV now, and but they can follow a little bit tighter. You know, I think this is going to require a mandate because the current manufacturers are being very cautious. They do not want to hit anything else. They don't want to be on the front page of the news the next day, and their computers are working very hard to stay at regular headways, you know, 2-second headways or something. We also added SAVs, so these were available for every 50 travelers or persons living in the region. And then we did a third scenario where lots of SAVs, so a 1 for every 10 agents. That's a pretty good ratio. Most people make about 3 trips a day, so this is like just 1 SAV for every 30 trips. Really easy to do in this particular region. And we didn't have a lot of self-driving vehicle ownership, but I think they did have access to a lot of conventional vehicles. So, you know, this is kind of where we will be in the next 5 to 10 years in many settings for choice. And the fares are lower than the current, let's say, the current TNCs and what we were using in this private AV scenario. So it just kind of gives you a sense of the different ways it can go in the US and across the world in different cities. And the base scenario, you know, there were no AVs, so it's most people in their car, this blue pie piece, and then public transit is a PT, and walking or biking in the gray. And once you give them a lot of AVs, they're relying on them just like they did on their conventional car when the AVs were not available. And there is some private car use, but they'd rather not drive, so not too many people are picking it because it has a higher burden, so a higher value of travel time for those that are driving the conventional cars that still exist to some extent. And only 4% of public transit share at that point. Pretty small. Look at this, just 1% share for that SAV slice. That's pretty sad. So most people relying on their own private AVs because we gave it to them. You know, it's like a birthday gift. And here's the scenario where we didn't give them their own private AV. They still had access to their conventional cars, so they're using those. And there's lots of SAVs that can get to them quickly at low cost. So we got about a 31% market share for the SAVs in that scenario. And some lucky people, I guess, had their own self-driving vehicle. And so as you can imagine, by adding these new technologies and sort of making driving easier, you're seeing maybe a 10% and then a 20% increase in miles per day on that network. These are smart vehicles. The ones being used as SAVs or AVs, so they're following it like a 30% tighter headway, let's say. But you know, may not make much of a difference if you're paying attention to signal lights and stop signs. So may make only a difference on the freeways. And vehicle mile traveled by empty SAVs, we were keeping an eye on that. So there were hardly any of them in that second scenario, so we don't see too much. But they're really adding that 0.3 million miles per day in this 1 million population region. And this delay in vehicle hours per day or per weekday, this is a weekday that we're evaluating, is going up, but people who are experiencing it may not care. Some of them may not care because they are in a self-driving vehicle, or at least this 37% of market may not care, but these guys should care. The people sitting in buses and the people sitting in their private cars will care because they're hands on the wheel, or compared to, you know, current bus use. That's added travel time. It's not fun to slow down. So we started adding some tolling strategies. One's really simple, just a flat rate toll depending on how congested the link was, and so it's only on the most congested links, and it varied from 10 to 20 cents per mile. And it was only during the peak periods because there really isn't much delay outside of those maybe 2 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the evening. And places where the volume to capacity ratios exceeded 0.9 was just about 4% of the Austin network. Certainly almost all of Interstate Highway 35 has got that. Lamar, and then this is Mopac and 183 and 290, they also have V over C ratios at some times a day that go over 0.9. And then we went distance-based everywhere. Every link that you travel has a simple VMT-based fee at every time of day. It's sort of like raising the gas tax from 40 cents per mile to maybe $2 per mile, which is still quite a bit lower than you will see even in places like China, which have much lower household incomes, right? So marginal cost pricing is something economists like to talk about all the time to reflect exactly what the delay is that you're sort of imposing on those who are alongside you or behind you in the traffic stream. And so we're looking at the free flow speed versus the actual speed and the length of that link that you're on, so that time difference and how many people are being impacted by that additional time. So McKelly used that for the toll. So he had a value of travel time multiplied by that delay, and then he had a new tolling strategy he came up with, which seemed to work really well, but it was a lot simpler actually, and easier than for the travelers also maybe to make sense of it. So he's looking at the delays, but he's summing it up over all the links that are being tolled, and that kind of streamlines this last scenario for us. And it did end up performing kind of the best, which is why, you know, he arrived at that scenario. So this is that fourth scenario, kind of travel time based, not as complex to estimate on the fly as the marginal cost pricing that economists will often evaluate, and certainly much more sophisticated than a simple distance based or even a high VC ratio link based toll. All of them do reduce, you know, do shift the mode around a bit. So this is the self-driving vehicles and the shared autonomous vehicle trip changes. You're seeing less use of them, as well as the other modes, except for walk bike maybe. And I guess public transit, we didn't make them pay the toll. So public transit also gained, but people who were in an SAV, like a taxi, they were paying the toll. It was being basically passed through the fleet manager to them. And those who were driving their own vehicles, you know, conventional or self-driving, were also. So these are just indications of some of the modes, how their splits fell. And here's the transit users. We're seeing that mode benefiting. Same with the walk bike, also went up probably by bigger percentages, because this is percent of transit users. There aren't that many transit users, so a 12% change in transit users is not a big change. And that travel time based one did not have much of an effect under either of the scenarios. We don't show you a gray column here for, you know, kind of the base scenario where we didn't have the self-driving vehicles, because these are difficult to apply tolls. So you want smart vehicles, ideally, to be able to pay them, although there were conventional vehicles, quite a few of them in that third scenario that would maybe have to be paying through some kind of special app on maybe a phone that stays docked in the car, something like that. And then there's the network changes, like how much vehicle mile traveled was saved by having the tolling, how much delay was saved by having the tolling. These 4 different scenarios on the tolling, right? And 3 different scenarios. The base case, which is old technology, so we didn't allow the more complex tolling technologies to take place under the base case. And then the SAV oriented one, which is of course the revolution we'd rather see than people just buying their own AVs. And so you're seeing VMT savings on the order of maybe 10%, which can make a big difference if it's at the right place at the right time. And the delay savings also maybe on the average of 10%, but certainly higher with these I guess not the travel time congestion scheme. It didn't really affect delays as much as you might want, but it was a simpler way to calculate it that didn't move the tolls around as much as this marginal cost pricing based strategy did. So this might be the most typical scenario that you might expect long-term in the US as the prices of AAVs fall, but hopefully the auto manufacturers are going to focus on rolling out the shared fleets. Tesla is kind of the one to watch here because they are shifting to, you know, a private owner market faster than maybe the Googles and the others of the world. So it's going to be a constant tension between private and sort of maybe public transit fleet managers basically paying Uber and Lyft or others to offer rides at a subsidy to people around the region. Or it'll be the private participants like Toyota rolling out its own fleet, or Cruise, which belongs primarily to General Motors. So they have a pretty neat business case on an all-electric platform. So we do care about welfare. I was showing you VMT and delays, but it's really, what do the travelers think about all this? There wasn't much of a benefit to the link-based scheme. We had maybe bigger benefits, but also some cases where on average, you know, the average Austinite actually suffered when you did a distance-based scheme. Of course, the DOTs would love more revenues. We charge hardly anything right now for gas. It's like 2 cents a mile if you drive a 20 mile per gallon vehicle. And so I pay less than 1 cent per mile. And of course, the Tesla would pay 0 per mile with the current gas tax in Texas and in most states. So the marginal cost pricing and the travel time congestion-based tolling that McKelly came up with, they had stronger improvements, even though they didn't maybe change VMT or delay as much as you would see with the distance-based scheme. They improved tolling, so not as much money was lost to the consumer, let's say. But I do think the gas taxes are too low to begin with, so I would really hope there'd be a combination of, you know, distance-based or gas tax-based, and of course, gasoline is a hazardous material, so it's always good to tax that for sure. But then the distance-based taxation also makes some sense as a user pay principle, even for those of us driving all electric vehicles. And then the travel time-based one, of course, very important for managing congestion impacts. So smart system management, those smarter strategies help make use of some of the technologies that are going to be on the smart cars anyway, and giving back the revenues or most of the revenues from those congestion pricing strategies as credit. So it's called credit-based or CB. That really helps people win regardless of whether they're driving a lot or not that much. They're getting some money that they can maybe use to rent a bike or ride the bus or possibly even kayak Town Lake here in Austin. You don't want them to take the cash and run with it because they will just pretend to live in the region and maybe spend that money while they're spending a few months in Europe or something. So you want to keep the spending of those credits local and mostly on a transportation product. So that's why I came up with kayaking in addition to, of course, busing and electric bikes. It doesn't have to be used on the road. So those credits that people, you know, basically get every month equally distributed across the residents of the region, or at least the adults, let's say, of the region, can be used on a number of things, but probably all transportation related and locally spent. The welfare gains are not significant. I mean, they're not dramatic, I should say. So, you know, it's, even though everybody complains about congestion, it's really not the worst thing, and it's not easy to address. There's a lot of technology and a lot of calculations going on to run these scenarios, and it's difficult. I can tell you Singapore is spending over $600 per vehicle to go to its Gen 2, and we don't even spend that much per vehicle over the course of a year on congestion. So it's going to be a tough benefit cost ratio for them to make, but you know, they care much more about public transit use and space savings and things like that on that island. So that's why they're doing it. The dynamic schemes are best, although there's always an important argument to be made for distance-based pricing as well, in addition to, and that's really an infrastructure question, not so much a congestion question. Lots of things we could do in the future, you know, parking choice, endogenous destination choice, that was not in the MatSim simulations that Michele used. So fortunately now we're working with POLARIS, and we can get that in there. And one last thing I did want to talk about Murty's congestion pricing work. So he had dynamic ride sharing and was more focused on that. He was also using MatSim at the time. He was rolling out different numbers of SAVs, to, you know, so high service levels versus somewhat low service levels, and trying to have the pricing mimic the current ride pooling apps that we have on our phones. And so depending on whether we had these three scenarios, a high cost, medium cost, and low cost scenario, what would it cost to be picked up if you're sharing a ride potentially with a stranger, and that plus the distance cost, and then a time-based cost. So this is how Uber and Lyft and probably Didi already charge, and then just lowering those values to see, you know, once you get rid of the driver and have more control over the fleet, you've got some economies there that you could pass on to your clients, your customers. And we use the most congested corridors in Austin for the congestion pricing, the CP, and that's also just during the peaks, which it turns out are just 4 hours a day in here. I really think that peaking starts at 3 o'clock as school gets out. So, you know, I guess Murty didn't feel that 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock were that bad, so he doesn't have them in this scenario. You know, the delays that are, he did something pretty simple here. What was the travel time on the links, on the congested links? He was charging a 5 cents per minute there, and he was using that MatSim code, which is dynamic traffic assignment code. And of course, he had to modify it, and that's Java. Polaris is C++, by the way. And he was using Sebastian Horl's code, which Sebastian had created as a student under Kai Oxhausen. He created it for taxi pooling, I guess, in Zurich. And so that's where we started. And we had, you know, the relatively few SAVs per traveler versus 1 SAV per every 10 travelers, let's say. And things were being matched really easily there when we were supplying a lot of SAVs to the same region, basically, the city of Austin. And so we've got these, this is the mode splits and vehicle miles traveled. Mode shares are on the left. These are bar charts summing up to 100, and then your increases in VMT is this orange line, but it's being tracked on the second axis. And here's the rates of SAV availability. So not too many, 1 for every 100 persons, 1 for every 50, 25, or 10 persons with pricing and without pricing. So there's no asterisk, there's no congestion pricing if these 4 bars do have the asterisk. So when we made SAVs very available, 1 for every 10 people, we saw VMT start to rise again. So maybe an 11% increase. This seemed to be a sweet spot, so just 1 SAV for every 25 travelers, and so they were being a little bit more efficient because not everybody was choosing the SAV. So we didn't want to have too many SAVs out there. This would flood the market, basically, the 1 to 10. And yeah, personal AV use, not big impacts depending on shared AV availability and pricing. We also looked at empty vehicle miles traveled, which are here on the left side, along with the idling. So how often that vehicle during like the business day was not doing anything. And this is the low DRS fares. So we have these kinds of results for the medium and the high fare scenarios as well. And you can imagine this looks like, well, so 5 cents per mile, that's really low. I would say 50 cents per mile. But you've got the 2 cents per minute, which is adding up to be about another 5 cents per mile as well. But yeah, this looks like really inexpensive. This is really, I think I don't think Uber and Lyft or anybody's going to get to this unless these are big vehicles with lots of people sharing the space inside them. So it might be a minivan or something like that that could maybe make a go of it with this kind of pricing in the long term. Average vehicle occupancy, that's always interesting. As you remember, we said that 25 persons per SAV was sort of a sweet spot. So you see the AVO spiking there, but it doesn't ever get that big. It was only about 1.57 at this point. And so we're not filling those seats, I'm afraid. And all of these travelers are single person travelers, which is an issue that I keep bringing up, and Murti and the guys at Argonne are going to tackle it, because apparently they've been doing this a long time with single trip makers. And in reality, we often take our children with us, we travel with a friend or a partner. So it is a little odd, but that's part of why we have such low AVOs. Once we do allow travel parties, these numbers will go up to recognize that. And here's revenues. There would be, from the side of a Lyft operator or maybe cruise, they're interested in revenues. How much are they paying for tolls? How many trips per day are they serving? I think trips per day is really interesting. Here it's not very high for this region. It says 1 million people, and reasonably big region, even though it is the city of Austin technically, and they just got up to 25 at their best, and that's not a lot. I think with our smaller regions, we were seeing 40 trips per day, and sometimes even 60 trips per day, but for this region, we weren't seeing more than 25, which is interesting. And it depends what kind of trip. It doesn't mean that the average trip is being served by the SAEV. Sometimes it's the longer trips, sometimes it's the shorter trips. It depends how you price it. So congestion pricing definitely helps, because that VMT is a real big concern. It's already a very serious issue during peak times of day in almost every region. And of course, if you think about crashes and you think about emissions, it doesn't matter if you travel in the middle of the night. That's actually when most of our crash deaths happen, is at night. And so all those losses are still happening, even if there's zero congestion in your network. So congestion pricing helps moderate that and the emissions as well as the congestion. And then, having very dynamic pricing is tricky. And when I say harmful, I think I'm imagining the consumer here, like their perspective. They can't really plan ahead on the travel. So Singapore has lots of good information and stability in their pricing decisions, and I think most Americans would want that as well, rather than something that's purely dynamic. Ride sharing is definitely helpful, but in the US, it's going to be tricky, especially if Tesla is selling directly to the consumer self-driving vehicles. So large and small fleets deliver relatively low dynamic ride sharing use, because there's just a lot of vehicles, and people can maybe wait a little bit longer until if one frees up that gives them a private ride. And so the matching is tricky at the kinds of densities that we see in the US. The fleet profits might be on the order of $100 or more per day, even with the low fare scenarios. And so that's kind of a special trade-off. I can lower my fare and get more users. And so really, what's the bottom line? It's more wear and tear on my vehicles, but I might actually end up making more profits on that. And we do factor in, the cost of administering the system, and when we calculate these profits. So lots of benefits in terms of safety. We didn't talk about that. Mobility for people who are limited right now, much better service than transit systems currently for most people. Parking benefits, no need to park your own car, and no need to maintain the vehicle if you rent it from somebody else, basically. So those headaches go to somebody else. But the congestion and the energy and emissions implications and some crash implications, because getting hit by a vehicle, even if it's your fault as a pedestrian, is a very injurious and potentially fatal experience. So SAVs are fabulous, and most countries are going to go for them. I really hope the US does as well, and can save us a lot of space and open up some new land use opportunities at the curb in downtowns, as well as on parcels, privately owned household parcels, residential parcels, free up hopefully a lot of opportunity for more affordable housing and denser settings, which then makes walking trips and other land use balance much more viable. So that extra VMT is an issue. That's why ride sharing is valuable in avoiding that pushback, and the travel cost savings by sharing a smaller vehicle only when you need it. Fantastic opportunities there, and but I do really feel that we still need to be looking at policies of credit-based road pricing. in addition to just pricing the hazardous material or the energy implications and the greenhouse gases, all those things also deserve pricing. But it's really the congestion that I think a lot of us worry about with the added VMT that needs a new approach that we haven't used yet. And smart vehicles can easily get us there. They can keep track of their own tolls on board without tampering. It's really hard for you or me to tamper with a computer on our vehicle. They're pretty locked down, or even on our phone or some other device. But you do have to think about enforcement and like random audits of those results that are being kept. They're being tracked, so vehicles or owners would be randomly audited to make sure that if we caught them on camera, that the vehicle is paying, as it already shows that toll being included in its monthly charge, or whenever it goes under a gantry and has to pay up. So that I did talk about quite a few papers here today, going back to work with Dan Fagnant and Donna Chen, Ben Loeb, Murthy Guru Murthy. The congestion pricing work, we have a few papers on that I think you might like. All of these are at my website in preprint format, because I can't share those directly publicly like that. But if you really want the PDF of the original publication, just let me know. And yeah, I hope I haven't gone too long, Charlotte, but that website with my goofy last name, has all of these details, and we'll have a bunch more papers up in a few weeks because of the TRB deadline that's coming up. So I think we're happy to take some questions. I don't know if you want to raise your hands and we can unmute you, or.
Yes, or they can use the chat function, either way, but thank you for that.
Ronnie, Dan, Amara, anybody with questions?
There is a question in chat box, I think.
What was the data collection procedure from these vehicles? So these aren't real vehicles. We're simulating all of this. And in terms of data collection, we're keeping track of, position every second or so. There's cellular transmission models used in POLARIS and MatSim. So it's not microsimulation. These are big networks. So I don't know anybody doing microsimulation generally. Maybe a computer scientist, but he or she would be missing a lot of other details. So yeah, it's dynamic traffic assignment, so we know where they are in terms of the cell that they're still in, and their arrival times, and who's on board, and what link they're on, so what the toll is in that position. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's the way I'm interpreting it. Sagar is asking, are SAVs suitable for big cities? Absolutely, and for travels between cities. So you guys know that a lot of people rent cars, right, when they're on trips. So you don't have to own a car. You can always rent. It can get very expensive. It's about $50 a day or maybe $30 a day. And of course, some people lease their cars. They don't own their cars. So you still pay for the gas as you drive along between cities, but that's very feasible. And Enterprise and Hertz and Toyota and Ford, they want to keep control of the vehicle if they can, and have it more as a service over time. And so they would love to, rather than just let go of that vehicle and whatever happens to it is now outside their control. They imagine that they will start keeping control. And part of that is so that they can update the software and maybe the hardware. Tesla updates the software over household Wi-Fi, for example. And so some people wake up to a brand new operating system. Other manufacturers aren't doing that. They only do that when you bring the vehicle to like the maintenance facility and near the showroom. Then they'll have somebody they trust update your software. But yeah, so they have some kind of control, and I think a lot of the OnStar vehicles, the manufacturer knows where you are because you're paying for that monthly service, and so we're going to kind of move in that direction. I don't think it'll be a problem at all. The vehicle won't belong to me, just like it doesn't when I go see my family in California. I'll rent a car there. It doesn't belong to me. So it's really easy to imagine. What would be nice if I could get that car to take me from the airport to my mom's house, and then I let go of the vehicle, right? And it goes and serves somebody else. That would be really nice, rather than my keeping it parked at her house. So it's a much more efficient use, I think, of that vehicle. Any other questions? Let's see, we've got anyone? The AV capability of my Model 3. So I did not like autopilot, how it was functioning. You know, I wasn't hearing great things. We've had the Tesla for a couple years now, and it was right when they started offering the lower price that we bought in, because it was $35,000. And so we had to pay $2,000 more to get it white. However, the base model was black, just like the Model T from Ford 100 years ago. So we had to pay $2,000 to get it in white, which I highly recommend in a hot climate and also for crash reasons. But yeah, it doesn't have the autopilot. We can always add that. Recently, they sent an email to us and said, hey, we're offering a new low price. You can add that. So the car has the cameras and the sensors that Tesla thinks are sufficient for self-driving. So you can always buy it later. They know they can always raise that price on me. And so they still have that control. But I don't drive that much. I don't drive in a lot of congestion and long distances. That's where a lot of Tesla owners really are so grateful that they have autopilot. And I do need to have better test experiences with it before I think it might be worthwhile. But it does have automated braking, and I think that's really key. And I think that should be required on all new vehicles in this country. And I think it's unethical that we don't require it right now. Let's see, somebody else. Can manufacturers make as many profits as they can since nobody will be buying vehicles? So I think vehicle sales are down about 50% right now, and Dan Sperling may agree, but that's from a conversation with an OEM around the world, so not just in the US. People aren't driving very much, so they don't really see the need for a vehicle. And of course, a lot of people have lost their jobs, so they've let go of a vehicle and they're sitting there on the used car lots. So there's a lot of used car availability right now. How many big cities have a test facility for CAVs or SAEs? Florida has the SunTrax facility. It's a 475-acre site. That's great. I think every city has a little test facility. Like here in Austin, we have the UT road. So we have a campus, and then we have a research campus. And so on those roads, but they're not nearly as interesting probably as the Michigan testing site. And then what you have in Florida, I know that Alameda County or maybe Solano or Dan would know. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, they have a place that they've been using. All it takes is private property. So you could go to an Apple, a major Apple complex or campus, and you could have these vehicles driving around. But they do have permissions to drive all the time in San Francisco, and now without a driver in the driver's seat. So there's no safety driver at all. They have very limited permissions, maybe 10 vehicles per testing group. And of course, Waymo has let go of a lot of its safety drivers in its Phoenix application. So Arizona is very gung-ho, so is Nevada. I think Florida is pretty gung-ho. So some states are really pushing the technology and trying to get the manufacturers interested in having the headquarters and things like that, maybe in their locations. And but yeah, you could test anywhere with either special permission or just find a UT campus, or a private campus by some business, and you can test there. It's just not as interesting as testing in the streets and the hills of San Francisco. Okay, that's a very exciting test spot. What have I missed, you guys? 2 new messages. And what changes you could see because of COVID? And yeah, COVID is very scary for people. We still see people using buses, but they try to spread out across the bus. In Manhattan, I think those subway cars do get pretty busy, and that's unfortunate. So people are masked, and a lot of them are younger rather than a higher risk group riding in them. I do think we're going to have probably a vaccine. I was reading Dr. Fauci's boss's interview, I think in the New Yorker, and so even though there was some uncertainty about whether we'd get one, it does look like we might have one within the year. I don't know how effective it will be. We have antivirals. I think people are going to get used to this new normal. But they're not going to drive as far. They're getting used to working from home, and their employers are getting used to working from home. So I think this habit will stay with us, unfortunately, for a very long time, although I'm pretty sure other species are really happy about the reduced travel that we're doing. Even though INRIX says that our VMT numbers have gone back to February, I don't see it here in the Austin region. And of course, airline miles are way down, maybe 90% down. So yeah, somebody was gonna add to that. Nan or Mazanur, did you guys want to say something?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. So if there is no question, I think.
I do have a question.
Please.
2 questions, Kara.
Please.
So you mentioned, so you don't think car manufacturers will let go of these autonomous vehicles, maybe for liability or maintenance reasons, reasons like you mentioned?
Yeah, well, I didn't say that, but I think you know probably the answer to that question. So Tesla is moving the needle towards private ownership for sure, even though Elon said, you can just, when you're not using it, let me use it and I'll share it with a bunch of people and I'll pay you some money to share it as a fleet. But I don't think most Tesla owners are going to do that because they tend to be wealthy to begin with. So they don't really need the extra cash to have strangers running around in their vehicle. But yeah, I think more other manufacturers are pretty circumspect. They do not want to have to manage all of that software remotely with a customer. They'd rather have a very tight contract, a very lengthy, detailed contract with a fleet manager, or do it in-house, right? But it'll probably be a partnership. Like I think Waymo recently announced a partnership with Volvo, and they announce a partnership with different groups regularly. Almost every year, you know, there's a different Waymo partnership, but they do need a manufacturer, right? And Volvo needs somebody who has a killer app or something, and Volvo's also going all electric, I think, or no, maybe that's VW, but they do want to be socially thoughtful and environmentally thoughtful, some of them. Maybe Tesla, of course, that was the whole genesis of Tesla, is electrified to help bring down environmental impacts. So yeah, I think that they're worried that the private customer is not going to clean the sensors. She's not going to want to deal with the software updates and doing that every day or something. And so they're, and she might take it out in a snowstorm or something. And so they really want an ironclad contract with a very sophisticated fleet manager, which may be themselves, but probably in cooperation with somebody who has more experience in that area.
I see, thank you. My other question is POLARIS. I just while you were talking, I did do a quick search. There's no download for it. So how did you get access to it? I know your student worked at Argonne, so you had privilege, but is it open source and also free or no?
It's not open source or free yet. So Argonne is part of the Department of Energy. So they do hope to, they just haven't heavily documented this. Like we're writing our own documentation for it, but it is part of the federal government. So eventually they do see this becoming free, and they're very nice to work with. So, you know, you might be able to get in there and help them in some way. And so it's a win-win. But yeah, it is, as I said, it is proprietary still. It's not like MatSim. It wasn't developed by, you know, an academician. It was developed by a lab researcher, and they're still in strong competition with the other labs. So there's like NREL, and there's Lawrence Berkeley, and all of these that they compete with. And so that's part of why they hang on to it, because it gives them a very powerful advantage on certain projects.
I see. So do your students find it easier to use than MatSim?
Well, I think they would prefer Java than C++. But yeah, just the capabilities are so great that they do prefer it.
I see. Okay. Good to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Of course, you guys, I hope you all have a great weekend, and you get out there and enjoy the sunshine and see some people, and just, you know, stay more than 6 feet away and mask up if you're inside, and yeah, try to enjoy this summer.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you, Kara.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.